I'm Josh Barrow, host of Left, Right, and Center, KCRW's weekly forum for civilized debate across the political spectrum. Today's news cycle demands more time for deeper analysis, so Left, Right, and Center is now a full hour every week. Subscribe and listen at kcrw.com/LRC.
On To The Point, we try to make sense of the policy debates and the political sideshows on the campaign trail.
Neither party's agenda really aligns with who its coalition is today.
It was the dumbest speech I have ever seen in my life of covering politics.
When people walk into a voting booth, at the end of the day, they do say, I really should vote for someone smarter than me.
I'm Warren Altney. To The Point has you covered for the 2016 campaign. Find the To The Point podcast on KCRW's iTunes page.
From KCRW Santa Monica and KCRW.com, it's The Treatment. Welcome to The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. So, you know the film The People versus Larry Flynt. You know the film Ed Wood. You know the film Big Eyes because the writers of those films, Larry Karaszewski and Scott Alexander, have been here talking about their work. They're now here talking about the biggest project they've done yet, American Crime Story, The People versus O.J. Simpson. Guys, first of all, welcome so much for coming back. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Elvis. It's always a treat.
And what's really interesting about this is that you guys, first of all, there's gallows humor in all these kind of really kind of awful events that happen, but so much of this really fits into your wheelhouse, which is to say opposing sides who are groups of outsiders or groups of misfits who happen to fall into each other. Is that one of the things that you sort of found immediately as you were looking at this?
I mean, we definitely were drawn instantly to the characters. I mean, I think this was a piece that we wouldn't have done as a film because there's so much of it, and putting it all into like 2 hours would have just been, you wouldn't have been able to get into anything in depth. But for us, we just instantly saw this, the opportunity in making it a 10-hour story. And that way, it could fit into our wheelhouse. We could spend time and pursue all the really strange offshoots that occur in the O.J. Simpson case. For us, that's the thing that really matches our tone, because we have that very, as you mentioned, that kind of peculiar tone where we mix, social satire with tragedy. We feel like comedy and drama should coexist, and that definitely is the case in the O.J. Simpson trial, because you've got, first of all, you got the murder of 2 innocent people, and we can never forget that. So you can't get too flippant, but there's such an absurdity to so much that happens. I mean, it's pulled from real life, but it's bigger than life. And all these characters saw themselves as being bigger than life. And they saw themselves as characters, so that we really enjoyed.
Yeah, but it's funny because they all, in their weird way, have created these sort of outsider societies for themselves, and they all have specialties. And that, again, that sort of seems to be what you guys do, too. People who think they specialize in something. These are people who actually do specialize in something rather than being delusional about specializing. But they are, in their own way, that's so full of ego.
Oh, yes.
And one of the things you guys are so great at doing, and this really lends itself to this, is where ego becomes almost this surrealist farce element.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a lot of fun in episode 4, which is all the defense guys jostling for power. And, you put F. Lee Bailey and Alan Dershowitz and Bob Shapiro and Johnny Cochran in a room. Well, a few catfights are going to break out.
Right. Well, that was one of the interesting things about the difference between the defense and the prosecution was the defense were very comfortable going to the media. They had these personas. I mean, you say they're misfits. We always joke that that's sort of like the Avengers. These guys were just, they were the reason why they were called the Dream Team, because they were just like these guys who were pundits and they were legal legends. F. Lee Bailey, Alan Dershowitz, Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, and strangely enough, Barry Scheck, and the guy who was the least famous of the bunch is Robert Kardashian, who now is the most famous of the bunch. It's completely absurd, but they knew how to shape a narrative to the press. They knew how to present this to America in a way that, say, Chris Darden and Marcia Clark couldn't, because they weren't used to the spotlight.
Sure, they were running back and forth from the criminal courts building to Larry King's studio.
But that becomes like a dramatic point in the later episode where Marcia is just sort of beside herself because she's realized that she can't compete with these guys in terms of dealing with the media.
Yeah. Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. I mean, the media became such a tail wagging the dog part of this trial. I mean, Ito put the camera in the courtroom, and that started the chain reaction. And I mean, we found that really interesting. I mean, even going back to the early episode where Marcia tosses a really good eyewitness who is the only person who saw O.J. during the prosecution's timeline because she went and sold her story to a TV tabloid. And Marcia, being idealistic, did not want to let the media dictate the narrative. But Marcia was wrong because that's what happened.
Yeah, but it's also too early enough, and it's over 20 years ago now, but it's early enough that people you could still be idealistic and naive in that way to think, no. At that point, there are only basically maybe TVs of some sorts on what used to be called court TV.
Yes.
But generally, we didn't have that very often.
No, I mean, we saw that as one of our big themes of the piece was the birth of 24-hour media, the birth of, that round-the-clock coverage. I mean, we sort of made a joke where, before the O.J. Simpson trial, CNN had, it was a 24-hour news channel, but they delivered you 24 hours of news. What O.J. taught them was they can deliver one news story for 24 hours. and that's how things changed. And in a weird sense, this whole celebrity culture, the whole reality television of it all, really you see the ground zero of that in the O.J. Simpson trial.
And O.J. was the case was so out of control that not only was CNN running the court TV reruns around the clock, then the big networks figured this out. And suddenly they're preempting their daytime schedule so they can run the trial too. So it's basically on every channel. I mean, it became about everything except for justice for two victims. It became about entertainment and becoming famous, and let's not talk about who killed these people. Let's talk about a referendum on the LAPD and race.
Right.
And it became about everything except who did it.
And these things are also interesting because it's all about these collisions of ideas, and but there still is some purity there. I mean, you guys treat Johnny Cochran, as played by Courtney Vance, as kind of really as an Avenger. I mean, and one of the things that's really so fun about the show, it's a bit of a digression here, is that each episode begins with a kind of a false lead. I mean, we think we're going to go one place, and in fact, we go someplace else. I mean, the episode where Marcia's in court, but we find out she's in family court.
Right.
Or the flashback to Johnny Cochran being pulled over. I mean, each episode has a start with something that's germane in the bigger sense, but it's not exactly important to the story that's being told. Right. And I wonder where that came from you guys.
Well, that came from, I think, just the marching order we kind of gave ourselves for the whole series was to come at it in a different way, to tell you things you don't know, to look at people from a different angle in the sense of, you brought up Cochran. I mean, Cochran, is that it almost became that parody of Cochran, which was what happened in Seinfeld, where this guy with the flashy coat and the rhymes and everything like this. But if we sort of said, well, what if let's really look underneath that, and we found that he was totally sincere.
And it was, and you think about him with Geronimo Pratt and all those people he was working with after that trial, and he didn't become one of these celebrities who was just still trying to make money. He was still keeping to his mission.
And that's where he fell into our wheelhouse, where you're correct from your first statement, in the sense that we sort of feel that people can hold contradictory ideas in themselves. I mean, he can be a peacock in a show about and also sincere about his journey. And so that's what I think we loved about Johnny Cochran. I mean,
we already in the first couple episodes we've seen him give very impassioned speeches about the shooting of Leonard Deadweiler on the freeway, and then we've also had him talk about having to run out to Neverland and deal with Michael Jackson. So we are saying, yes, this is a man with many sides to him.
Right. Well, we try to do that with almost all the characters. I mean, because I think if you were alive back in 94 and 95, you definitely came away with an opinion about all these people, a very strong opinion. Whether Chris Darden was a traitor to his community, or Marcia Clark was a bitch, or whatever it is. We wanted to show you the other side, how Chris was a person without a country, where he felt trapped, and he also and tell you things about him you don't know, about him being from Oakland, about him being wanting to leave the SID from the very beginning, about him having a prior relationship with Cochran. And this is all stuff that you sort of knew but sort of didn't know when you were watching that trial originally, and we really wanted to play that up.
It's a dream. We're talking about the People versus O.J. Simpson, American Crime Story, with the writers, creators of it, Larry Karaszewski and Scott Alexander. I guess one of the things I find myself thinking about, too, is one of the things that lends itself to this story for you guys as well, there's often somebody who's sort of tortured about their relationship to the central figure. In this case, it turns out to be Robert Kardashian, who is, in his way, the soul of decency, because he wants to believe.
Totally. When we started doing the heavy research, he was the character who surprised us the most.
Yeah? Did you not have the sense of what he was?
Very little. Going into it, he was just that mysterious figure with the skunk stripe in his hair.
Who actually didn't say much during the trials.
Right. No, I'm not sure I'm not sure he ever spoke during the trial. I mean,
He's not a criminal lawyer.
He's not a criminal defense attorney.
He's really thrown on the case by the guys just so someone can babysit
him, and also, I mean, there might have been some
legal
some
machinations.
loops within loops there in terms of, well, if he's his lawyer, he can't testify against him.
Exactly.
Right.
But truly, like Larry's saying, Shapiro recognized that O.J. was going to need a lot of hand-holding. And Kardashian was the guy to do it. And the more we read about him, he seemed to be the only guy there who was not looking out for number one. He was being completely selfless. He was a very serious guy. He was a very religious man. He had asked his friend, did you do it? His friend had told him no. And he was going to say, well, then I will stick by you and I will stick it out to the end. And he becomes really conflicted over the 10 episodes as the evidence starts piling up against O.J., particularly after the DNA evidence comes out, and it becomes harder and harder for him to stick to his promise. And we just thought it was so interesting to have a character who just sort of represents the conscience of the show.
Right.
And also, you're talking about the Avengers. I mean, this is in its way, because so many different kinds of origin stories. And getting to see the origin of the Kardashian kids. Right. I mean, that's their sheer sort of excitement about being famous.
Well, here's the thing: the kids themselves are really only in about 5 minutes of the entire 10 hours. So, but they have a couple choice moments, and any mention of them at all takes over the Twitterverse, and some people think that they're in it too much, but they're really in it only 5 minutes. But we felt that you just had to ask that big question: is what would it be like if your father was one of the central figures? Your father was actually the person who read O.J.'s suicide note on that day when 95 million people were watching TV, and we actually went back to those tapes, and Kardashian did have to spell his name. No one knew who this person was. And so that was really the first time you heard the name Kardashian. And so for us, we just asked that question, well, what if the little kids were watching this? I mean, doesn't that put the seed of the whole empire right there?
And just as, perverse absurdity to say that it all started because their dad had to read a suicide note. Yeah. It's just we can't leave that out.
Well, what attracted you guys? What made you decide it was time for you to write television? Because you've not really done that.
It was the project. Obviously, movies have been collapsing. Studios don't want to make the mid-budget dramas anymore. This isn't a newsflash, and lots of good writers are moving over to TV. We've had a few meetings. We've dabbled with a few projects. We've gone in with some producers, but nothing ever felt right. And Larry and I have a joke, which is we didn't understand what the characters are going to do in the living room every week.
Our conception of television is very 1970s.
Yeah. It's just like, well, what are Archie and Edith going to talk about every week? Right. We don't understand this.
And we also don't understand how to solve crimes. We really don't know how, the case of the week.
Yeah, procedural, we would be a disaster. So the few projects that we were gravitating towards were mini-series because they have an ending.
Right.
And at least if there's an ending, it gives us a comfort level because, we've been writing features for 1,000 years and, the first, second, and third acts, that is just what our minds live in. And so when we heard that Brad Simpson and Nina Jacobson had the rights to Jeff's book,
Jeff Toobin,
we lit up and we said, yeah, we want to do it.
But the book's also chock full of people, too, and the whole tableau is chock full of people who, in their way, wanted to be bigger than they were. I mean, we talked about that a little bit. I mean, wanted to either sort of have their egos fulfilled or fulfill this mission. And there's always this kind of sense of sort of white knuckling for your protagonists, people just holding on to something for dear life because they have to try to make this thing happen.
Right.
And these people are all this, aren't they?
Yeah. And also it's one of those things where we sort of all know the story, and instead of that hurting us, I think it helped us because the tragedy that's about to happen. You know the mistakes that are going to occur.
There's a lot of hindsight.
There's a lot, so you're just able to oh no, don't do that. Oh please, Marcia, don't do that.
No, don't cut your hair. Don't do
please. Oh no, it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. Well, don't put on the gloves. Don't have him put on the gloves.
Chris, just leave the gloves alone.
With those spoiler alerts, we're going to take a break. It's The Treat with my guests, Larry Karaszewski and Sky Alexander. They've written American Crime Story, The People vs. O.J. Simpson on FX. There's more to come. Stay with us.
This podcast is produced by nonprofit radio station KCRW. KCRW relies on member support to help keep our programming fresh and authentic. Find out how you can donate at kcrw.com/join.
Welcome back. Well, don't listen if you don't want to know what happens to O.J. Simpson and the people versus O.J. Simpson. It's on FX, the writers of the show. Scott Alexander, Larry Karaszewski are here with me. You mentioned before the break, Scott, you're talking about procedural. And there's even like a bit with that almost feels like a parody of procedural. We get to see Mark Furman talking about the way the case played out, his investigation. And we see all these details with Van Adder. You go, that's even the procedural aspect of this.
We made a very conscious decision that episode 1 was going to be like a Jack Webb production. This is Dragnet. This is crew cut policemen walking in their clunky shoes, and they're just doing their jobs. And here's the evidence, and there's the blood drops. There's a fingerprint here, and there's a melted ice cream there, and wait a minute, there's blood inside the Bronco, and they're taking note, and they're being very diligent about their work. And this was really important to establish this mountain of evidence, sort of from the police's point of view, which becomes the prosecutors and the audience's point of view, which is, wow, this guy really did it. There's no way he's getting off. And then the next 9 weeks become how it just turns to sand in their fingers.
Right.
And all of this rock-solid evidence that we saw, suddenly it starts being questioned.
Right. And what's funny is even though we just joke that we can do a procedural, what we really do love is process. That I think that, and that particularly was been great about having 10 hours, but even in our movies, we like the minutia of detail that adds up to to plot.
And also the application of effort.
Correct.
I mean, the people that you guys have done these things about, people who apply themselves to these practices they take up.
Right.
Yeah, and to do it right, I mean, Larry and I sort of have to wallow in the minutia. So there's the great moment in the first episode. A great moment, just it really happened, where O.J. was notified that Nicole had died, and he did not ask how she died, which is pretty telling. But to back it up and do it sort of Scott and Larry style, we needed to see, Detective Lang say, "Where's O.J.?" And then Arnell Simpson say, "Oh, he's in Chicago." "Okay, where?" "Oh, there's a hotel." "Okay, well then he's going to have to call the hotel. And then the hotel operator's going to have to answer the phone. And then the operator's going to have to connect you to O.J. Simpson's room." And we like all those little steps because it like gives you just a slow build, and then you finally get to that big line. You go, oh my God.
But even something like this in terms of character, like Chris Darden becoming a member of the team. I think a lot of people would just simply have him be a member of the team. But we like the fact that to find out all the little details that are going on in his life, all the directions he's going, and all the ways that he could have not been on the team, so that when it actually happens, it actually means something.
And he also becomes a person too who is kind of the voice of common sense. In that, because these are all, in their way, a great number of entitled white people who can't see the forest for the trees.
Yes.
And Marcia won't listen to him when he's saying, well, this guy is, and there's a great line that says, well, he's one of the people who thinks he's being polite. If he acts like he's being polite, then you can't see what's wrong. She goes, if he's acting polite, then he is polite.
Yeah. Yeah. That's probably the key line that says that Marcia Clark does not get it. That strange enough, they'll deny it, but there's part of the reason Chris was brought on the case was to balance Johnny Cochran, was to have an African-American prosecutor on the team. But what's funny is that they got him on the team, but yet they didn't listen to him. They didn't use the fact that they had an African-American prosecutor on the team and who could feel things and knew things that they did not.
Gosh, there's so much to talk about here. But one of the things I really want to talk about, because you guys have dealt with really social impacts and so much of things you've done. And this gives you a chance really in the big way, in a way I haven't seen in American television in a very long time, to deal with race. And we're talking about that kind of entitlement, just the Time magazine team putting that cover together and talking about chiaroscuro and Rembrandt.
Yes, thank you.
You just made a black man blacker so he looks like a criminal. I mean, it's just a whole sort of thing where even they don't see what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Time magazine moment is crazy because technically Time was doing nothing any different than what they do every week, which is, okay, we need some art for the cover. And they're on a tight deadline, and
we're talking about the infamous O.J. Simpson cover where he's made darker.
And they had an artist they worked with who had done a lot of covers for them who actually knew how to manipulate stuff digitally, which is very early on in '94. And it was like, okay, it's midnight, we need it by 3 a.m. I mean, it was rushed deadline. And so he manipulated the image, and he made it more dramatic. And Time probably would have gotten away with it, except for the fact that they didn't know that Newsweek was going to run the identical picture in the exact same size, and it was going to hit the stands the same day.
And unretouched.
Untouched, yeah.
Unretouched. And so it's OJ's mugshot, regular and darker.
Right.
What do you think?
But also that mugshot run on court TV, the unretouched mugshot run everywhere.
Right. Yeah.
So that
but in fairness to Time, because they were weekly, they knew everyone was going to have seen the mugshot.
And this talked about in the episode.
Yes. So, we're trying to show how there were just so many moving parts in this case.
Right, but that's a great example of how Scott and I use kind of this, like, what's a paragraph in Tubin's book of just information about the Time magazine cover and turn that into plot and it's the way, so you actually go into the Time magazine, studios, and you see them doing it. You see it hit the stands. You see Darden's reaction. You see it land on Shapiro's desk. And that's where race starts to become an issue for Robert Shapiro. He's starting to put together, how can I get this client who just appears to the entire world to be completely guilty? How can I get at least some chip for a plea bargain or something? And, oh, look at this. Maybe it's a black thing.
But it is, because as a person of color who may have been trying to be known as an appreciator of art, I can sort of see what they were trying to do, but I can also see how that looked.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of thing.
It may have been tone deaf.
Well, that's one way to put it. Literally tone deaf in this case. It's the treatment we're talking about for race and satire with the creators of American Crime Story, The People versus O.J. Simpson, Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski. But that, to me, is important because what this show really is so much about is what it's like in these kinds of cases when there's not a person of color in the room to sort of say, you shouldn't do this.
Right.
And when he is in the room, he's not listened to.
Right.
I mean,
which is the total difference from the prosecution to the defense, which is, when Shapiro hires Cochran, I think Shapiro thinks that he's going to be able to control Cochran, and Cochran, pretty quickly kicks him to the curb. And Cochran runs that show and knows exactly what all these pieces mean.
Because he's also been on both sides of the law.
Correct.
Totally.
Correct.
But the show, and having race play into this too, is how corruptible people are by fame. That's really what you guys are really. That's almost the thing of everything you've done. That fame corrupts everybody, and we get to see what it does here. I mean, some people buckle under the fame, but fame is an American infection that you guys are really interested in dealing with.
I mean, it was interesting that there was a bunch of analysis written after the Bronco episode, and people were really sort of fixating on the moment where the cops walk up to the stopped Bronco on the freeway and then let them drive away. And if you take a step back and go, oh my God, so the LAPD had a DNA match on OJ. They had him 5 feet away. He is the primary suspect. He's the only suspect. And they let him just drive off. It's insane.
Well, because they don't.
You cannot, but you can't do it to the juice.
Right.
And what you're talking about, fame trumps all. I mean,
right.
I mean, there's a great moment where Cuba Gooding Jr., as O.J. just says, when the idea of bringing Johnny Cochran into your team is introduced, he says, I'm not black, I'm O.J.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really powerful moment. And again, it sort of deals with that idea of fame being this kind of infection where he's got to be bigger than being a black person.
Right. Which that was very important to us because when we were talking in the writers' room with Brad Simpson and some of the other writers, we kept on coming up to the fact that we said there's been a bunch of times in recent America history that we think we're post-racial. We think, we're so much better now, and then something slaps you in the face, and that's what O.J. thought. He was post-racial. It's when Obama became president. It happens all the time, and even when we started making the show 3 years ago, it didn't occur to us that all the Ferguson would happen, and Eric Gardner, and all the and just while we're in production, and all these issues just kept coming up, and I think I don't think we thought about ourselves as doing a period piece before that, but it definitely shocked us to feel like, my gosh, we're writing something that really feels torn from the headlines.
In a lot of ways, even though it's a period piece and we know the outcome, it's about the way things shockingly haven't changed.
Yeah,
totally.
I mean, it's almost painful to watch in that way. And I just wonder if it was good for you guys to have a director of color on the show because there's an episode with Nathan Lane as F. Lee Bailey that has some pretty astonishing language. Now, first of all, talk about that episode, if you wouldn't mind.
That is where F. Lee Bailey has to get Mark Fuhrman to say the N-word.
Right.
And going into the whole Fuhrman storyline, Larry and I were a little paralyzed at first in terms of are we really going to type this? And then are they going to let us say this on the air? But it became an interesting dance with the Fox lawyers, and everyone kind of came to the realization that this is such an important part of the story, and we weren't trying to use it for shock value.
Right.
But you mentioned having a director of color. I just want to do a shout out. I mean, Anthony Hemingway, who's African American, directed 5 of the episodes, did a bang up job. John Singleton directed an episode, and then Ryan Murphy directed the other 4, and then we had Joe Robert Cole, who's African American,
in the writing room, and Maya Forbes,
and then a couple white guys, DeVincentis and Wally Wolodarsky.
Yeah. But what's funny though is about the color blindness of it all is that we could write these Oakland scenes, and Joe, it turned out he was the best person to write the Dominic Dunn scenes. I mean, his Dominic Dunn lines were hysterical. And so it's one of those things where when you're actually just typing on the page, there is a sense of color blindness. Either you understand the characters or you don't understand the characters. And, that was great that Joe knocked those Dominic Dunn scenes out of the park.
I want to talk, too, about the idea of casting Cuba Gooding Jr. as O.J. Simpson.
Right.
I mean, how talk about getting him to do this.
Well, that's an interesting segue because Cuba's not doing an imitation of O.J. Simpson, but I think he's actually perfect. Scott and I both have teenage kids. I mean, teenage or late teenage, early 20s, and they only know O.J. Simpson as the guy in jail. Kind of the chubby guy who's sad and a guy who everyone thinks murdered his wife, and there's no life force in O.J. Simpson anymore. And so we felt it was very important to remind people of who O.J. Simpson was, remind people of how beloved he was, that he was he was an African American celebrity that America welcomed into their home, and that he was a sports figure, he was a movie star, he was in he gave Fred Astaire's cat back in The Towering Inferno.
He's a spokesman for one of the largest corporations in the world.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal.
Yeah. And so the casting of Cuba, just the iconography was right. That Cuba is such a likable movie star. He's an Oscar winner. And it was funny, there's a film columnist named Jeff Wells who really got upset when we cast Cuba, and his whole column was about, I could never believe Cuba Gooding Jr. as a killer.
Is that the point?
And that is the point. That was like, I was like, you just don't get it. That is what we wanted, because we wanted to put people back in that mindset for that first month or so. Like, O.J. couldn't have done it, and Cuba couldn't have done it.
And it's a terrific show, by the way. It really is. And you must be really pleased with the ratings for this, because people are just responding to it, aren't they?
Yeah. No, it's one of those things when we first did the show, we didn't know whether it's too late, too early, but it just seems to have hit the right time. And people are digging it, and people are talking about it, which is really, that's really pleasing.
I think, though, it has actually the scale of a movie. I mean, you're just seeing how big it is, and also how big the actors are. There's a great cast in this. I mean, having movie stars and then having stage actors like Courtney and Nathan Lane, who can also really make those scenes play. You've just got to be thrilled by having all these pieces come together, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the scale of it. Nobody told us what not to do. So Larry and I were coming out of features, so it's like, okay, so you're just typing in, okay, what comes next? A freeway chase. Okay, cool. So we just start writing, a 30-page freeway chase. And if we had been TV veterans, we wouldn't have gotten near that scene. We would have figured out how to cut away. Yeah. Because TV shows can't afford to shoot freeway chases. But we just typed it, and it just slid through the system. And then, about 2 weeks before production, somebody in physical production at Fox had a heart attack, saying, "What the? Who authorized this?" But it was too late, so they had to do it.
Well, see, you're learning what to do and what not to do. We're out of time, guys. Thanks so much for doing this.
Elvis.
My guests are Larry Karaszewski and Scott Alexander. They're the writers and creators of the American crime story, The People vs. O.J. Simpson. Our recording engineer who also mixes the show is Kat Yor. The show is edited by Blake White, who's associate producer. I'm running for my life, too. It's The Treatment. To catch up on past episodes of The Treatment, go to KCRW.com or listen on your smartphone with KCRW's mobile apps, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts. The Treatment is produced and distributed by KCRW Santa Monica.